What would you do if you were surrounded by 50,000 enemy soldiers, freezing in a foxhole at -20 degrees, with no ammunition, no food, no medicine, and absolutely no hope of rescue? What would you do if every single officer around you had already accepted that death was coming, that the white flag was the only reasonable option left? Now imagine that in the middle of that frozen hell, through the fog and the snow and the endless German artillery, a single man appeared. A ghost, a shadow, a warrior who had walked alone through 12 miles of enemy territory, carrying nothing but a rifle and a message that would change the course of the entire war. Before you hear what General Dwight D. Eisenhower said when he learned about this man, I need you to do something for me. First, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from right now, and then, please, hit that subscribe button because this channel needs your help to keep bringing you these incredible stories that the history books tried to bury. Now let me tell you about the Kiowa sniper who walked into Bastogne. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The last desperate gamble of Adolf Hitler was unfolding across 200 miles of frozen woodland, and the American forces were being systematically annihilated. The German offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, had caught the Allied command completely off guard. 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, had smashed through the weakest point in the American line and were now racing toward the critical supply port of Antwerp. If they succeeded, the war in Europe would be extended by years, perhaps indefinitely. At the center of this catastrophe stood the small Belgian town of Bastogne. 7 major roads converged at this crossroads, making it the single most strategically important position in the entire region. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of the German advance. The High Command in Berlin knew this, the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force knew this, and the 18,000 American soldiers trapped inside the town knew this better than anyone. The 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles, had been rushed to Bastogne on December 18th, arriving just hours before the German forces completed their encirclement. They had come straight from rest camps in France, many of them still recovering from the brutal fighting in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They had no winter clothing. They had limited ammunition. They had almost no armor support, and now they were completely surrounded by 4 German divisions, with more arriving every hour. The commanding officer of the Bastogne defense was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, an artillery specialist who had never commanded troops in combat before this moment. His second in command was Colonel William Roberts of the 10th Armored Division, whose tank destroyers had been reduced to fewer than 40 operational vehicles. Together, these 2 men were responsible for holding a perimeter that stretched nearly 16 miles around the town, against an enemy that outnumbered them almost 3-1. On the morning of December 22nd, a delegation of German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message was formal, almost polite. It explained that the American position was hopeless, that further resistance would only result in the complete annihilation of the garrison, and that the honorable thing to do was surrender immediately. The German general promised that all prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. He gave McAuliffe 2 hours to respond. The story of what happened next has become one of the most famous moments in American military history. General McAuliffe, upon reading the German ultimatum, reportedly laughed and said a single word that would echo through the decades. When his staff asked him what response they should send, McAuliffe thought for a moment and then said simply, "Nuts." The official reply, delivered to the confused German officers, read in its entirety to the German commander, "Nuts, the American commander." The German officers had no idea what this meant. They asked the American colonel who delivered the message if this was an affirmative or negative response. The colonel smiled and said, "It means the same as go to hell." And if you continue to attack, we will kill every single one of you. But what the history books rarely mention is what happened in the 72 hours that followed. Because while McAuliffe's defiance made for an excellent headline, it did nothing to change the tactical reality on the ground. The ammunition was running out, the medical supplies were gone, frostbite casualties were mounting faster than combat casualties, and somewhere out there, beyond the German lines, General George Patton was racing his Third Army northward to break the siege. But Patton was still 3 days away, maybe 4, and the German commanders had decided that Bastogne would fall on Christmas Day. The weather was the cruelest enemy of all. A thick fog had settled over the Ardennes, making aerial resupply impossible. The Army Air Corps had been trying to drop ammunition and medical supplies for days, but the transport planes could not find the drop zones through the impenetrable grey ceiling. Without air support, without resupply, the defenders of Bastogne were slowly dying. The wounded filled every building in town. The surgeons operated by candlelight, without anesthetics, without proper instruments. The dead were stacked in frozen rows behind the church because the ground was too hard to dig graves. It was in this context, on the night of December 23rd, that Private First Class Joseph Running Horse made his decision. Running Horse was a full-blooded Kiowa from the town of Carnegie, Oklahoma, a small community in Caddo County where his family had lived since the reservation era. He was 23 years old, stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, and weighed 155 pounds. He had enlisted in the Army in 1942, 2 weeks after his 18th birthday, and had qualified as an expert marksman during basic training at Fort Sill. His instructors noted that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours at a time, a skill his grandfather had taught him during childhood hunting trips on the plains of western Oklahoma. Running Horse had been assigned to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne, as a designated marksman. In the 3 months since D-Day, he had confirmed kills of over 40 German soldiers, including 7 officers and 3 enemy snipers. His fellow soldiers called him Ghost because of his ability to disappear into any terrain, to move without sound, to kill without warning. The Germans had a different name for him. They called him Der Kiowa Teufel, the Kiowa Devil. On the night of December 23rd, Running Horse approached his company commander, Captain Marcus Wheeler, with an unusual request. He wanted permission to leave the perimeter alone, travel through the German lines, and make contact with General Patton's advancing forces. He wanted to personally guide the relief column through the weakest points in the German encirclement. Captain Wheeler thought he had lost his mind. The conversation was later reconstructed from Wheeler's personal diary, which was donated to the National Archives in 1978. According to Wheeler's account, Running Horse stood in the basement of a bombed-out farmhouse, calmly explaining his plan while German artillery shells exploded in the streets above. Wheeler wrote, "He spoke as if he were describing a walk to the grocery store. He said he knew the terrain. He said he could see in the dark. He said the Germans were spread too thin, and there were gaps in their lines. I told him it was suicide. He smiled and said that death had been chasing him since the day he was born, and she had never caught him yet." Wheeler initially refused the request. The idea was insane. The German lines were 12 miles deep in some places. They had patrols everywhere. They had listening posts. They had dogs. No single man, no matter how skilled, could possibly walk through that gauntlet and survive. But Running Horse was persistent. He explained that he had been studying the German positions for 3 days. He had identified a route through the forest, following frozen streams and dense pine thickets that would allow him to bypass the main defensive positions. He estimated the journey would take between 14 and 18 hours. What convinced Wheeler to approve the mission was not Running Horse's confidence. It was a piece of intelligence that had arrived earlier that day via a coded radio transmission from Third Army headquarters. The transmission revealed that General Patton's 4th Armored Division was approaching from the south, but had encountered unexpected resistance near the town of Chaumont. The relief column was stalled. They needed accurate information about the German positions around Bastogne. They needed to know exactly where to strike, and they needed this information within 48 hours or the garrison would be overrun. Wheeler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He authorized the mission. He gave Running Horse a hand-drawn map showing the known German positions, a written message for General Patton from General McAuliffe, and his own personal compass. He also gave him something else, something that Running Horse would carry against his chest for the entire journey. It was a photograph of Wheeler's wife and 2 young daughters back home in Pennsylvania. Wheeler asked Running Horse to deliver it to his family if he made it out alive, and Wheeler did not. Running Horse left the American perimeter at 0300 hours on December 24th, Christmas Eve. The temperature was minus 22 degrees Celsius. The snow was 18 inches deep. The fog was so thick that visibility was reduced to less than 30 feet. He carried his Springfield M1903 A4 sniper rifle, 40 rounds of ammunition, a bayonet, a canteen of water that would freeze solid within 2 hours, and 3 chocolate bars that a medic had given him. He wore no helmet, choosing instead a traditional Kiowa fur cap that his mother had sent him from Oklahoma. He had painted his face with charcoal and white clay, not for camouflage, but because this is what his ancestors had done before going into battle. The first 3 miles were the most dangerous. This was the inner ring of the German encirclement, where the forward infantry units were dug in along every road and ridgeline. Running Horse moved through this zone at an agonizingly slow pace, sometimes covering less than 100 yards in an hour. He crawled through frozen ditches. He slithered beneath barbed wire. He pressed his body against the snow and became invisible whenever a German patrol passed nearby. At one point, around 0430, he came within 15 feet of a German machine gun position. 2 soldiers were huddled around a small fire, trying to warm their hands. Running Horse could hear them talking. One was complaining about the cold. The other was talking about his girlfriend in Munich. They never knew he was there. He passed them like a shadow, like a whisper of wind through the frozen pines, and continued on his way. The middle section of his journey took him through the German artillery positions. This was where the heavy guns were located, the howitzers and mortars that had been pounding Bastogne for 6 days straight. Running Horse counted 37 artillery pieces in a 2-mile stretch. He memorized their exact positions. He noted the ammunition dumps. He identified the command posts. This information would prove invaluable when he finally reached Patton's forces. As dawn approached on Christmas morning, Running Horse encountered his first serious obstacle. A German motorized patrol was blocking the forest path he had planned to use. There were 8 soldiers and 2 motorcycles with sidecars. They appeared to be waiting for something, perhaps a supply convoy or a shift change. Running Horse knew he could not go around them. The terrain on either side was too open. He would be spotted immediately. He made a decision that would later be described in his Silver Star citation as demonstrating extraordinary valor and tactical brilliance. He climbed a large pine tree approximately 200 yards from the German position. The tree was covered in snow, and its branches were so thick with ice that they groaned under any weight. Running Horse ascended 60 feet into the canopy, found a stable position, and waited. For 2 hours he did not move. His muscles screamed, his fingers went numb, his lungs burned with every breath of frozen air. But he waited. He waited because he knew that patience was the greatest weapon any warrior could possess. His grandfather had taught him this during those long hunting trips on the Oklahoma plains. "The deer does not run because you are cold," his grandfather had said. "The deer runs when you move. So you must not move. You must become part of the forest. You must become invisible." At 0745, a German supply truck arrived at the patrol checkpoint. The soldiers gathered around the vehicle, lighting cigarettes, sharing rations. For approximately 90 seconds, all 8 soldiers were clustered within a 30-foot radius of the truck. Their weapons were stacked against the motorcycles. Their attention was focused on the food. Running Horse took his first shot at 0746. The round struck the senior non-commissioned officer in the base of the skull. Before the body had finished falling, Running Horse had chambered a second round and fired again. The second shot hit a corporal in the chest. The third shot, fired less than 3 seconds after the first, killed the driver of the supply truck as he tried to reach the radio. The remaining 5 soldiers scattered in panic. They had no idea where the shots were coming from. The sound echoed through the frozen forest, bouncing off trees and ridgelines, making it impossible to locate the source. Running Horse killed 2 more before they reached cover. The 6th died trying to retrieve his rifle from beside the motorcycle. The 7th was wounded, crawling through the snow toward the tree line. When Running Horse's 7th shot found him, the 8th soldier escaped. He ran northward through the forest, screaming for help, and Running Horse made the calculated decision not to pursue him. The mission was more important than a single enemy soldier. He descended from the tree, crossed the road, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. Behind him, 7 German soldiers lay dead in the snow around a supply truck that was still running. Word of the attack spread quickly through the German lines. By noon on Christmas Day, patrols were searching the forest for the American sniper who had massacred an entire checkpoint. But Running Horse was already miles ahead of them. He moved faster now, knowing that stealth was no longer his primary advantage. Speed was what mattered. He had to reach Patton before the Germans realized where he was going. At approximately 1400 hours on December 25th, Private First Class Joseph Running Horse emerged from the tree line near the village of Eisenhower, directly in front of the lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. The American tankers almost shot him. He was covered in snow and mud. His face was painted like a warrior from another century, and he was carrying a German Mauser pistol that he had taken from one of the dead soldiers at the checkpoint. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion and future Chief of Staff of the United States Army, was the first officer to speak with Running Horse. Abrams would later describe the encounter in his memoirs. He wrote that Running Horse walked toward his tank with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. He wrote that the young Kiowa soldier saluted, handed him a folded piece of paper, and said simply, "General McAuliffe sends his compliments and requests that you hurry. The boys are getting cold." The piece of paper contained detailed information about every German position between Eisenhower and Bastogne. It showed the artillery emplacements. It showed the infantry concentrations. It showed the exact location of the gaps in the German line. It was, in Abrams's words, the most valuable piece of tactical intelligence he had ever received. Running Horse personally guided the 37th Tank Battalion through the German defenses. He sat on the hull of Abrams' Sherman tank, pointing out enemy positions, identifying safe routes, warning of ambushes. When they encountered resistance near the village of Sebrade, Running Horse dismounted and eliminated 3 German anti-tank crews with his rifle before they could fire on the American armor. At 1650 hours on December 26, 1944, the tanks of the 37th Battalion smashed through the final German defensive line and entered Bastogne. The siege was broken. The defenders who had held out for 8 days against impossible odds were finally relieved. And walking at the front of the column, still carrying his Springfield rifle, still wearing his Kiowa fur cap, was Private First Class Joseph Running Horse. General Anthony McAuliffe was waiting at the edge of town. He had heard the sounds of battle approaching. He had seen the German lines collapsing. And now he watched as American tanks rolled down the main street for the first time in over a week. When Running Horse climbed down from Abrams' tank, McAuliffe walked up to him personally. According to witnesses, the general stood silent for a long moment, studying the young Native American soldier who had accomplished the impossible. Then McAuliffe removed his own scarf, a wool scarf that his wife had knitted for him, and wrapped it around Running Horse's neck. He said only 4 words: "Thank you, son. Merry Christmas." But the story does not end there. Because when news of Running Horse's mission reached Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, it created a sensation. The war correspondents wanted to interview him, the army wanted to give him medals, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe, wanted to meet him personally. The meeting took place on January 3, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles, France. Running Horse had been cleaned up, given a new uniform, and briefed extensively on proper military protocol when meeting the Supreme Commander. He was nervous. He had grown up in a small town in Oklahoma, the son of farmers and ranchers, and now he was about to shake hands with the most powerful military officer in the Western Hemisphere. Eisenhower's aide, Lieutenant Commander Harry Butcher, kept detailed notes of the meeting in his diary. According to Butcher, Eisenhower entered the room and immediately walked past several senior officers to stand directly in front of Running Horse. The Supreme Commander studied him for a moment, then smiled and said something that would be repeated in military circles for decades afterward. Eisenhower said, "Private Running Horse, I have commanded millions of soldiers across 2 continents. I have worked with presidents and prime ministers and kings. I have seen courage and cowardice, brilliance and stupidity in equal measure. But I have never, in all my years of service, encountered anything quite like what you did at Bastogne. You walked alone through 12 miles of enemy territory. You killed enemy soldiers with a precision that our intelligence officers still cannot fully explain. You delivered information that saved thousands of American lives, and you did all of this without anyone ordering you to do it. You volunteered. You chose to walk into that frozen hell because you believed it was the right thing to do. That, son, is what separates warriors from soldiers. I'm honored to stand in your presence." What happened next shocked everyone in the room. According to Butcher's diary, Running Horse reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a German Iron Cross, first class, which he had taken from the body of a German officer during his journey through the enemy lines. He handed it to Eisenhower and said, "My grandfather told me that a warrior keeps nothing for himself from battle. Everything belongs to the people. This belongs to you, General. Give it to your wife." Eisenhower accepted the Iron Cross. His eyes, according to Butcher, were glistening with tears. The Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe, the man who would later become the 34th President of the United States, was crying. He shook Running Horse's hand and said, "When this war is over, I want you to come to Kansas and meet my family. I want my grandchildren to know that men like you exist. I want them to understand what true courage looks like." Running Horse was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, and the Purple Heart during the remaining months of the war. He fought in the crossing of the Rhine, the capture of the Ruhr Pocket, and the final advance into Germany. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel near Cologne, and once by a sniper near Munich. Both times he refused evacuation and returned to his unit within days. When the war ended in May 1945, Running Horse returned to Carnegie, Oklahoma. He rarely spoke about his experiences in Europe. When asked about Bastogne, he would only say that he did what any Kiowa warrior would have done. He married a woman named Mary White Elk in 1947, had 4 children, and worked as a ranch hand until his retirement in 1982. But the story of what happened at Bastogne refused to stay buried. In 1963, a historian named Stephen Ambrose interviewed Running Horse for a book about the Battle of the Bulge. The interview lasted 14 hours over 3 days. Running Horse spoke about things he had never told anyone, not even his wife. He spoke about the cold. He spoke about the fear. He spoke about the faces of the German soldiers he had killed, and he spoke about something else, something that would only be revealed publicly after his death in 1991. Running Horse told Ambrose that during his journey through the German lines, something had guided him. He called it the voice of his ancestors. He said that when he was hiding in that pine tree, waiting for the German patrol to let down their guard, he had heard his grandfather singing. The old man had been dead for 15 years, but Running Horse heard him clearly, singing a Kiowa war song that had been passed down through generations. And when Running Horse took his shots, when he killed those 7 German soldiers in less than 30 seconds, he felt his grandfather's hands on his shoulders, steadying him, guiding his aim, protecting him. Ambrose included this detail in his original manuscript, but his publisher insisted it be removed. They said it was too mystical, too strange. They said it would undermine the credibility of the historical account. So the story of Running Horse's ancestors was cut from the book. It remained hidden in Ambrose's personal papers for decades. In 1994, 3 years after Running Horse's death, his daughter Margaret donated a box of her father's personal effects to the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Among the items was a small leather pouch that Running Horse had carried throughout the war. Inside the pouch was a single eagle feather, a small piece of red cloth, and a folded piece of paper with words written in the Kiowa language. When tribal elders translated the document, they discovered it was a prayer, a warrior's prayer. It asked the Creator for the strength to protect his brothers, for the wisdom to know when to fight and when to be still, for the courage to face death without fear. And it ended with a promise that the warrior would honor his ancestors by living with dignity, by treating his enemies with respect, and by never forgetting that all life is sacred. Running Horse carried this prayer against his heart for the entire war. He carried it when he walked through the German lines at Bastogne. He carried it when he guided the tanks into the besieged town. He carried it when he met General Eisenhower at Versailles. And according to his family, he was holding it when he died peacefully in his sleep on a cold December night in 1991, the 47th anniversary of the day he walked into history. But here is where this story takes a turn into territory that the official histories never acknowledged. Because in the years after Running Horse's death, researchers began to uncover documents suggesting that his mission was not as spontaneous as everyone had believed. There were indications, buried in classified files that were only declassified in 2009, that someone at the highest levels of the Allied command had specifically requested a volunteer for exactly the kind of mission Running Horse performed. The documents, originally stored in the National Archives under a restricted access code, revealed that on December 22, 1944, General George Patton sent a coded message to the commanders of every unit between his position and Bastogne. The message requested a volunteer for an exceptionally dangerous reconnaissance mission. The volunteer needed to be an expert marksman, experienced in independent operations, and preferably someone with wilderness survival training. The message specifically mentioned that Native American soldiers should be given priority consideration due to their traditional tracking and hunting skills. Captain Marcus Wheeler received this message approximately 6 hours before Running Horse approached him with his plan. Wheeler never mentioned this to Running Horse. He never told anyone that the mission had been suggested from above. In his diary, Wheeler wrote that he approved Running Horse's request because the young soldier's confidence convinced him it might actually work. But the classified documents tell a different story. Wheeler had already been ordered to find a volunteer. Running Horse simply made his job easier. This raises uncomfortable questions that historians are still debating today. Did Running Horse truly volunteer of his own free will, or was he manipulated into a suicide mission by commanders who saw Native American soldiers as expendable? Was Patton's request for indigenous volunteers motivated by genuine tactical considerations or by a racist assumption that native lives were worth less than white lives? And most disturbing of all, how many other Native American soldiers were sent on similar missions during the war, missions that ended not in glory, but in anonymous death? The official records show that Native Americans served in the United States military during World War II at a higher rate per capita than any other ethnic group. More than 44,000 Native Americans served in uniform between 1941 and 1945. They fought in every theater of operations. They served as code talkers, pilots, infantrymen, medics, and yes, snipers. Their contributions were immense, their sacrifices were profound, and their stories were systematically suppressed for decades after the war ended. Running Horse was one of the lucky ones. He survived, he came home, he lived to see his grandchildren. But thousands of his brothers did not. They died on beaches and in forests and in the frozen mud of places whose names they could not pronounce. They died fighting for a country that had taken their land, killed their buffalo, and tried to erase their culture. And many of them died on missions just like the one Running Horse completed at Bastogne, missions that were too dangerous for white soldiers, missions that command considered acceptable losses. The descendants of Joseph Running Horse still live in Oklahoma. His great-granddaughter, a woman named Sarah Running Horse Whitman, is currently a professor of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In 2018, she published a book about her great-grandfather's life, titled The Kiowa Warrior. In the book, she writes about visiting Bastogne for the 70th anniversary of the siege. She writes about walking the same forest paths her great-grandfather walked. She writes about standing in the snow where he killed those 7 German soldiers. And she writes about something she found there, something that still exists, something that should not. In a small clearing approximately 3 miles from the village of Eisenhower, Sarah found a tree, a large pine tree with branches that grew thick and low to the ground. The tree had been struck by lightning at some point, leaving a scar that ran from the highest branches all the way down to the roots. But on the trunk, about 60 feet up, Sarah noticed something strange. There were marks in the bark, old marks, weathered by 70 years of Belgian winters, but still visible. Claw marks, as if something had climbed the tree long ago and left its signature behind. Sarah climbed the tree. It took her almost an hour, and she nearly fell twice, but she made it to the spot where the marks were deepest. And there, carved into the wood with what must have been a bayonet, she found 3 words in the Kiowa language. The words translate roughly to, "I was here," but the literal meaning is closer to "my spirit touched this place." Her great-grandfather had left his mark. 70 years earlier, on a frozen Christmas morning, Joseph Running Horse had climbed this tree and carved his presence into its trunk. He had made himself permanent. He had ensured that even if he died that day, some part of him would remain. The Kiowa believed that warriors never truly die. They believe that the spirits of the brave continue to walk the earth, protecting their descendants, guiding them through darkness. And perhaps in some way that Western science cannot explain, Running Horse is still out there, still watching, still protecting. Sarah Running Horse Whitman ended her book with a question that haunts everyone who reads it. She asked, "What would America look like if we actually honored the native soldiers who fought and died for this country? What would happen if we told their stories with the same reverence we reserve for white heroes? What would change if we admitted that some of the greatest warriors in American military history came from nations that America tried to destroy?" These are questions without easy answers. These are questions that make people uncomfortable. These are questions that challenge everything we think we know about patriotism, about sacrifice, about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. But they are questions we must ask. They are questions we owe to Joseph Running Horse and the thousands like him, They are questions we owe to ourselves. In the years since Sarah published her book, something strange has been happening at Bastogne. Tourists who visit the battlefield report hearing things in the forest, footsteps in the snow when no one is there, a voice singing in a language they do not recognize, the smell of gunpowder in places where no shots have been fired for generations. Some say it is just the wind, some say it is imagination, but others believe it is something more. They believe the Kiowa warrior is still walking. They believe Joseph Running Horse never left. If you ever find yourself in the Ardennes forest, particularly on a cold December night when the fog rolls in and the world goes quiet, listen carefully. You might hear him. You might feel his presence moving through the trees, patient as he was that Christmas Eve so long ago. And if you are very lucky, you might see him, a shadow among shadows, a ghost wrapped in snow, a warrior whose spirit refused to die. Remember this story. Share it with others, because the moment we forget the men and women who sacrificed everything for our freedom is the moment we lose ourselves. The battle at Bastogne was not won by generals in warm headquarters making grand strategic decisions. It was won by young men like Joseph Running Horse who walked alone into the darkness because someone had to. It was won by courage that defied logic, by faith that defied fear, by love that defied death itself. And in these dark times, when it feels like the world is surrounded by enemies on every side, when hope seems as distant as that relief column must have seemed to the defenders of Bastogne, remember what Running Horse did. Remember that one person, armed with nothing but determination and faith, can change everything. Remember that the night is always darkest just before dawn. And remember that somewhere out there, the spirits of warriors past are watching over us, guiding us, protecting us, waiting for us to become worthy of their sacrifice. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. In them you will find the same strength that carried Running Horse through those frozen miles. In them you will find the same peace that allowed him to face death without fear. In them you will find purpose and meaning and a love that transcends all understanding. Because at the end of all things, when the battles are over and the smoke clears, what matters is not how we fought, but why we fought. And Joseph Running Horse fought for something greater than himself. He fought for his brothers. He fought for his ancestors. He fought for a future he would never see. That is the definition of true courage. That is what it means to be a warrior. And somewhere in the Ardennes, on nights when the snow falls silent and the world holds its breath, the Kiowa devil still walks, still watches, still waits, because some spirits are too strong to die. Because some stories are too important to end, because some warriors never stop fighting, not even death can keep them from their duty. The question is, are you ready to hear him? Are you ready to honor his memory? Are you ready to become the kind of person he would be proud to protect? Only you can answer that question. Only you can decide what his sacrifice means to you. But know this. Whatever you choose, whatever path you walk, Joseph Running Horse walked it first. He walked it alone. He walked it in darkness, and he emerged into the light. May you find the courage to do the same. The story of Joseph Running Horse should have ended with glory and recognition. It should have ended with parades and monuments and children learning his name in school. But that is not what happened. What happened instead reveals something far darker about the nation he served, something that powerful people worked very hard to keep hidden, something that is only now beginning to emerge from the shadows of classified archives and suppressed testimonies. In the summer of 1946, approximately 14 months after the war in Europe ended, a young Army intelligence officer named Lieutenant Robert Castillo was assigned to review and catalogue prisoner interrogation records from the Ardennes campaign. Castillo was the son of Mexican immigrants from San Antonio, Texas, and he had served as a translator during the Nuremberg trials before being reassigned to this seemingly mundane archival duty. What he discovered in those dusty files would change his life forever, and set in motion a chain of events that continues to reverberate to this day. Among the thousands of interrogation transcripts, Castillo found a folder marked with a red classification stamp that he had never seen before. The stamp read Schwarze Sonne, which translates from German as Black Sun. Inside the folder were 17 pages of testimony from a captured SS officer named Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Kessler, who had been interrogated by American intelligence in January 1945, just weeks after the siege of Bastogne was lifted. Kessler's testimony was extraordinary. He claimed that the German High Command had received intelligence about Running Horse's mission within hours of its commencement. He claimed that a special unit had been dispatched to intercept the Kiowa sniper, a unit composed not of regular Wehrmacht soldiers, but of SS commandos specifically trained in counter-sniper operations. He claimed that this unit had tracked Running Horse through the forest for nearly 8 hours on Christmas Day, coming within 200 meters of him on multiple occasions. And he claimed that every single member of this unit had died under circumstances that the German command could not explain. According to Kessler, the SS counter-sniper team consisted of 12 men, all veterans of the Eastern Front, with extensive experience hunting Soviet partisans. They were equipped with the finest weapons the Reich could provide, including experimental infrared night vision scopes that had just been developed by the Zeiss Optical Company. They had dogs, they had radio communication, they had overwhelming numerical superiority, and yet, by the morning of December 26th, all 12 were dead. The bodies were found scattered across a 3-mile stretch of forest between the villages of Cibre and Eisenhower. Some had been shot cleanly through the head or heart, the signature of a skilled marksman, but others had died in ways that defied rational explanation. One soldier was found hanging from a tree branch 30 feet above the ground, his neck broken, with no indication of how he had gotten there. Another was discovered in a frozen stream, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror, with no visible wounds anywhere on his body. A third was sitting upright against a pine tree, his eyes wide open, his rifle still in his hands, with frost covering his face as if he had simply stopped living and waited for the cold to take him. Kessler testified that the German command initially attributed these deaths to Running Horse alone. But as investigators examined the evidence more closely, they began to doubt this conclusion. The distances between some of the bodies were too great. The timing did not make sense, and most disturbing of all, several of the dead soldiers had been killed by methods that did not match Running Horse's known capabilities. The man hanging from the tree, for example, weighed over 200 pounds. Running Horse weighed 155. It would have been physically impossible for him to lift that body into position, especially while being pursued through hostile territory. The German investigators eventually concluded that Running Horse had not acted alone. They believed he had received assistance from an unknown source, assistance that they could not identify or explain. Kessler's testimony included a chilling phrase that one of the investigators had written in his official report. He wrote, "The American Indian did not walk through our lines. He was carried. Something was with him. Something was protecting him. Something that we could not see." Lieutenant Castillo was disturbed by this testimony. He was even more disturbed when he discovered that the Kessler file had been scheduled for destruction. A notation in the margin, dated March 1946, indicated that all copies of the interrogation were to be incinerated as part of a program called Operation Dustbin, which was the code name for the systematic destruction of sensitive documents captured from Nazi Germany. Someone had decided that this testimony was too dangerous to preserve. Castillo made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He made a copy of the Kessler file and smuggled it out of the archive. He hid the copy in his personal effects and carried it with him when he was discharged from the army in 1947. For the next 40 years, he told no one about what he had found. He married, had children, built a successful career as a history professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and kept the Kessler file locked in a safe deposit box at a bank in San Antonio. In 1989, 2 years before Joseph Running Horse died, Castillo finally decided to act. He was 71 years old, recently widowed, and increasingly haunted by the knowledge he had carried for 4 decades. He contacted a journalist named Maria Esperanza, who worked for the San Antonio Express News and had a reputation for investigating stories that other reporters would not touch. He gave her the Kessler file and asked her to find out the truth. What Esperanza discovered over the next 2 years of investigation was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. She tracked down surviving members of the 37th Tank Battalion who had entered Bastogne on December 26th. She found relatives of the German soldiers who had died pursuing Running Horse. She obtained classified documents through Freedom of Information Act requests that had been denied for decades, and she interviewed Running Horse himself in what would be one of the last extensive conversations he ever had about his wartime experiences. Running Horse was reluctant to speak with her at first. He had spent most of his life avoiding publicity, deflecting questions about Bastogne, insisting that he had simply done what any soldier would have done, but Esperanza was persistent. She showed him the Kessler file. She showed him the German report that claimed something had been protecting him, and she asked him directly what really happened in that forest. According to Esperanza's notes, which were later donated to the Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas, Running Horse sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes after reading the German documents. His hands were trembling, his eyes were wet with tears, and then he began to speak in a voice so quiet that Esperanza had to lean forward to hear him. He said that he had never told anyone the full truth about that night, not his commanding officers, not the generals who pinned medals on his chest, not even his wife of 43 years. He said that he had kept silent because he knew that no one would believe him. He said that what happened in the Ardennes forest on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1944 was not something that could be explained by Western logic or military science. It was something that belonged to a different world, a world that his people had known for thousands of years, a world that the white man had tried to destroy. Running Horse told Esperanza that he had not walked through those German lines alone. He told her that from the moment he left the American perimeter, he had felt a presence beside him, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him, walking with him, matching his pace exactly, breathing when he breathed, stopping when he stopped. He could not see this presence, but he could feel it. He could sense its warmth in the frozen air. He could hear its heartbeat beneath the sound of distant artillery. At first, he thought he was hallucinating. The cold does strange things to the mind. Hypothermia can cause vivid sensory disturbances. He told himself that the presence was simply a product of exhaustion and fear, a coping mechanism that his brain had created to help him survive an impossible situation. But as the night wore on, he began to doubt this explanation. The presence was too consistent, too real, too purposeful. When he climbed the tree to ambush the German patrol, he felt the presence climb with him. When he aimed his rifle at the first German soldier, he felt hands on his shoulders, steadying his aim. When he pulled the trigger, he heard a voice whisper in his ear, a voice speaking in the old Kiowa language, words that his grandfather had taught him as a child. The voice said, "Do not fear them. They cannot see us. We are invisible. We are the wind. We are the snow. We are the ancestors who never die." Running Horse killed 7 men in less than 30 seconds that Christmas morning. But he told Esperanza that he did not feel like he was the one pulling the trigger. He felt like a vessel, a channel, an instrument through which something ancient and powerful was expressing its will. He said it was the most terrifying and the most sacred experience of his entire life. The pursuit that followed was even stranger. Running Horse knew that the Germans were coming. He could hear their dogs. He could see their flashlights flickering through the trees. But every time they got close, something would happen to divert them. A tree would fall across their path. A sudden gust of wind would scatter their scent trail. One of the dogs would inexplicably refuse to continue forward, whimpering and cowering, as if it sensed something that the humans could not perceive. Running Horse described one moment that haunted him for the rest of his life. He was hiding in a shallow depression beneath a fallen log, covering himself with snow and dead leaves, when a German soldier walked directly over his hiding spot. The soldier's boot came down less than 6 inches from Running Horse's face. Running Horse could see the mud on the sole. He could smell the leather. He could hear the soldier's heavy breathing. But the soldier did not see him. The soldier looked directly at the spot where Running Horse was hiding and saw nothing. It was as if Running Horse had become invisible, as if the snow and the leaves and the forest itself had reached up and swallowed him whole. Later that same night, Running Horse witnessed something that he had never spoken about until that conversation with Esperanza. He was resting briefly in a thick stand of pine trees when he heard screaming in the distance. German screaming, multiple voices, crying out in terror and confusion. The screaming lasted for perhaps 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Running Horse did not investigate. He continued on his mission. But he knew, with a certainty, that transcended rational thought, that the presence walking beside him had done something. It had acted to protect him. It had eliminated a threat that he had not even known existed. When Esperanza asked Running Horse what he believed this presence was, he answered without hesitation. He said it was his grandfather. He said it was his great-grandfather. He said it was every Kiowa warrior who had ever lived and died defending his people. He said that the spirits of the ancestors do not abandon their descendants. He said that when a Kiowa goes into battle with a pure heart and a sacred purpose, he is never alone. The entire weight of his lineage stands beside him. The accumulated courage of 100 generations flows through his veins. Running Horse also told Esperanza something that she found almost impossible to believe. He told her that the presence had spoken to him one final time, just before he emerged from the forest and made contact with the American tanks. It had spoken in his grandfather's voice, but the words were not in Kiowa. They were in English, and the words were, "Tell them the truth. Tell them what you saw. Tell them that we are still here. Tell them that we have not forgotten. Tell them that we will never forgive." Running Horse did not tell anyone the truth. Not for 46 years. He kept the secret because he was afraid that people would think he was insane, afraid that his medals would be revoked, afraid that his testimony would be used to mock and diminish his people. He had seen what happened to Native Americans who claimed to have spiritual experiences. They were dismissed as superstitious. They were labeled as primitive. They were used as evidence that indigenous peoples were incapable of functioning in modern civilization. But in that final interview with Maria Esperanza, with only months left to live, Running Horse finally broke his silence. He finally told the truth, and he finally delivered the message that his grandfather's spirit had asked him to deliver nearly half a century earlier. The message was not one of reconciliation. It was not one of forgiveness. It was a warning. Running Horse said that the spirits of his ancestors were angry. They were angry about what had been done to their people. They were angry about the broken treaties and the stolen land and the children torn from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language. They were angry about being forgotten, about being erased, about being treated as relics of a vanished past rather than members of a living culture. And Running Horse said that this anger was not passive. It was not merely a sentiment or an emotion. It was a force, a power, something that existed in the world and could act in the world. He said that his experience at Bastogne had taught him that the boundary between the living and the dead was far thinner than most people believed. He said that under certain circumstances, the dead could intervene in the affairs of the living. they could protect, they could guide, and when necessary, they could punish. When Esperanza asked Running Horse what he meant by punishment, he fell silent for a long moment. Then he told her about something that had happened in 1973, nearly 30 years after the war. In 1973, the American Indian movement occupied the village of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It was a protest against the corrupt tribal government and against the broader pattern of federal mistreatment of native peoples. The occupation lasted 71 days and ended with 2 Native Americans dead and a federal marshal paralyzed. It was one of the most significant acts of indigenous resistance in the 20th century. Running Horse was not at Wounded Knee. He was too old for that kind of activism, and he had always been uncomfortable with confrontational politics. But he told Esperanza that he had prayed during those 71 days. He had performed ceremonies that his grandfather had taught him. He had called upon the ancestors to protect the people at Wounded Knee, just as they had protected him in the Ardennes forest. And something had answered. Running Horse told Esperanza that federal agents who participated in the Wounded Knee siege began experiencing strange phenomena in the years that followed, nightmares that would not stop, voices in empty rooms, shadows that moved independently of their sources. Several agents suffered mental breakdowns, several committed suicide, several died in accidents that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Running Horse did not claim responsibility for these events. He did not claim that his prayers had caused them, but he said that the ancestors do not forgive those who harm their descendants. He said that the blood debt accumulated over centuries of genocide and displacement could not be erased by apologies or policies or well-intentioned programs. He said that the spirits were keeping a ledger, and that one day, perhaps not in his lifetime, perhaps not for many lifetimes, the account would be settled. Maria Esperanza never published her investigation. She completed a manuscript of over 300 pages, documenting everything she had learned about Running Horse, the Kessler File, and the mysterious events in the Ardennes forest. But in April 1991, just 2 months before Running Horse died, she received a visit from 2 men in dark suits who identified themselves as representatives of the Department of Defense. They informed her that her manuscript contained classified information that could not be made public for reasons of national security. They confiscated her notes, her recordings, and all copies of the manuscript. They made it very clear that any attempt to publish the material would result in severe legal consequences. Esperanza never saw those men again. She never recovered her research. She died in 2003, still bitter about the story she'd been prevented from telling. But before her death, she managed to preserve one thing. She had memorized the key details of her interviews with Running Horse, and she had written them down in a personal journal that she kept hidden from everyone, including her family. That journal was discovered after her death by her grandson, a young man named Diego Esperanza Montoya, who is currently a documentary filmmaker based in Austin, Texas. In 2019, Montoya began working on a film about his grandmother's suppressed investigation. He traveled to Carnegie, Oklahoma, to meet with Running Horse's descendants. He visited Bastogne and walked the same paths that Running Horse had walked 75 years earlier. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the documents that had been confiscated from his grandmother. Most of those requests were denied, but some were granted. And what those documents revealed was shocking. The documents confirmed that the United States government had been aware of the supernatural elements of Running Horse's story since at least 1946. The documents showed that the Kessler File had been flagged by a secret program within Army intelligence that was specifically tasked with investigating unexplained phenomena related to indigenous spiritual practices. The program was called Operation Thunderbird. and it had been created in response to reports from multiple theaters of World War II, suggesting that Native American soldiers seemed to possess abilities that could not be explained by conventional military training. Operation Thunderbird continued for over 2 decades, eventually being absorbed into a larger program that investigated paranormal phenomena during the Cold War. The documents that Montoya obtained through his FOIA requests showed that Running Horse had been under surveillance for years after the war. Federal agents had monitored his movements, intercepted his mail, and interviewed his neighbors under the pretense of conducting routine background checks. They were watching him. They were studying him. They were trying to understand how he had done what he did at Bastogne. The surveillance files included a disturbing detail that Montoya highlighted in his documentary. In 1958, a team of researchers from a classified government program attempted to contact Running Horse and persuade him to participate in a series of experiments. The researchers wanted to test his marksmanship abilities under controlled laboratory conditions. They wanted to measure his physiological responses during stress, and they wanted to conduct what they called cultural interviews, which would document his spiritual beliefs and practices in exhaustive detail. Running Horse refused. According to the files, he told the researchers that what he had experienced at Bastogne was sacred and could not be reduced to data points and experimental protocols. He told them that the ancestors had helped him for a specific purpose, not to become a laboratory subject for the white man's curiosity. He told them to leave and never come back. The researchers left, but the surveillance continued. The government never stopped watching Joseph Running Horse. They watched him until the day he died. Montoya's documentary, titled The Kiowa Devil, premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival in March 2020. It received enthusiastic reviews, but limited theatrical distribution. Several major streaming platforms expressed interest in acquiring the film, but ultimately declined, citing concerns about the documentary's claims regarding government surveillance of Native American veterans. One executive allegedly told Montoya that the film was too controversial and would generate negative publicity that the platform was not prepared to handle. The documentary is currently available for viewing on a small independent streaming service. It has been watched by fewer than 100,000 people, but those who have seen it describe it as one of the most important and disturbing films ever made about Native American history and the hidden dimensions of American military operations. What does all of this mean? What are we supposed to conclude from the story of Joseph Running Horse and the strange events that surrounded his mission at Bastogne? These are questions that do not have easy answers. They are questions that challenge our assumptions about reality, about history, about the nature of courage and the persistence of the human spirit. But perhaps the most important lesson of Running Horse's story is not about the supernatural at all. Perhaps the most important lesson is about memory, about who we choose to remember and who we choose to forget, about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we suppress, about the debt we owe to those who sacrificed everything for our freedom and the ways we have failed to honor that debt. Joseph Running Horse walked alone through 12 miles of enemy territory on the coldest night of the year. He did this not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. He risked his life to save the lives of his brothers, many of whom had never seen a Native American before they joined the army, many of whom held prejudices and assumptions about indigenous peoples that Running Horse had every reason to resent. But he did not resent them. He loved them. He loved them enough to die for them. That is the definition of a hero. That is what heroism looks like when it is stripped of politics and ideology and reduced to its purest essence. One person, alone, walking into the darkness to bring light to those who have lost hope. And yet for decades, Running Horse's story was barely known outside of military history circles. The textbooks mentioned the Battle of the Bulge. They mentioned General McAuliffe's famous response to the German ultimatum. They mentioned Patton's relief of Bastogne. But they rarely mentioned the Kiowa sniper who made that relief possible. They rarely mentioned the Native American soldier whose intelligence guided the tanks through the German lines. They rarely mentioned the man whose ancestors, whether literally or figuratively, walked beside him through the frozen forest. This erasure was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was part of a broader pattern of diminishing and ignoring the contributions of indigenous peoples to American history. It was part of a system that celebrated white heroes while consigning native heroes to footnotes and appendices. It was part of a culture that could not reconcile its mythology of westward expansion and manifest destiny with the reality that the people it had conquered were capable of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Running Horse knew this. He understood that his story would never be told the way it deserved to be told. He understood that he would never receive the recognition that white soldiers received for far lesser accomplishments. And he accepted this, not because he agreed with it, but because he had learned long ago that fighting every injustice was a path to madness. Some battles you win, some battles you lose, and some battles you simply survive. But survival is not the same as silence. And Running Horse, in his final years, decided that silence was no longer acceptable. He decided to tell his story to Maria Esperanza. He decided to reveal the truth about what happened in the Ardennes forest. He decided to deliver the message that his grandfather's spirit had entrusted to him nearly half a century earlier. That message deserves to be heard. It deserves to be considered. It deserves to be wrestled with and debated and ultimately perhaps accepted, because the anger of the ancestors is not going away. The wounds of history are not healing. The ledger of blood and betrayal continues to accumulate, and one day, whether through natural consequences or supernatural intervention, the account will be settled. If you have watched this video to the end, you have already taken the first step. You have listened. You have learned. You have allowed the story of Joseph Running Horse to enter your consciousness and take root. Now the question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you share it with others? Will you seek out more information about the Native American soldiers who served and sacrificed for this country? Will you examine your own assumptions about indigenous peoples and the role they have played in American history? These are not rhetorical questions. They are invitations. They are opportunities. They are doorways to a deeper understanding of who we are as a nation and who we might become. The spirit of Joseph Running Horse is watching. The spirits of all the ancestors are watching. They are waiting to see what we will do. They are waiting to see if we have learned anything from the horrors of the past. They are waiting to see if we are worthy of their sacrifice. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. In their love, you will find the strength to face uncomfortable truths. In their wisdom, you will find the courage to acknowledge the sins of the past. In their mercy, you will find the hope that redemption is possible, for individuals and for nations alike. The same faith that carried Running Horse through the frozen darkness can carry you through whatever challenges you face. The same God who watched over that Kiowa warrior watches over you. But remember this, faith without action is empty. Belief without behavior is meaningless. If you truly want to honor the memory of Joseph Running Horse and the countless Native American soldiers who served alongside him, you must do more than pray. You must act. You must speak. You must stand against injustice wherever you find it. You must become the kind of person that the ancestors would be proud to protect. The Ardennes forest is quiet now. The guns have been silent for 8 decades. The snow still falls every winter, covering the ground where so many young men died, smoothing over the scars of battle, creating the illusion of peace. But beneath that peaceful surface, the spirits are stirring. They remember what happened here. They remember the courage and the fear, the sacrifice and the suffering, the moments of heroism that the history books recorded, and the moments of mystery that they did not. If you ever visit Bastogne, take a moment to walk into the forest. Walk alone, if you can. Walk until the sounds of the town fade away and the silence of the trees surrounds you. Then stop, stand still, listen. You might hear the wind moving through the branches. You might hear the distant call of a bird. You might hear nothing at all except the beating of your own heart. But if you are very quiet, if you open yourself to possibilities that your rational mind would normally reject, you might hear something else. You might hear footsteps in the snow. You might hear a voice singing in a language you do not understand. You might feel a presence beside you, neither threatening nor comforting, simply there, watching, waiting, remembering. That is Joseph Running Horse. That is the Kiowa devil. That is the warrior who walked through hell and emerged into legend. He is still out there, still walking, still watching over the land where he proved that one man, armed with faith and courage and the blessing of his ancestors, could change the course of history. His story is not over, his mission is not complete, and until the debts of the past are paid, until the wounds of history are healed, until the nations learn to honor those who sacrificed everything for their freedom, he will continue to walk. He will continue to watch. He will continue to wait. The question is not whether you believe this. The question is whether you are willing to live as though it might be true. May the spirit of Joseph Running Horse guide you. May the courage of the ancestors inspire you. May the love of God sustain you. And may you never forget that in the darkest moments of human history, there have always been those who chose to walk into the darkness, carrying nothing but hope. Be one of those people. Be a light in the darkness. Be worthy of the sacrifice. The ancestors are watching. They have not forgotten, and neither should you.